Hello everyone, welcome back to the 10 days of JavaScript. Here we are in day number 10, the finale of this first chapter, and in this lesson we are going to finally move from theoretical to practical, or from abstract to concrete. I want to begin by showing you the finished product of what we are going to build together in this lesson. So we've got a headline here, to-do app, and then we have a form or input field which I can type into, feed cat. Submit it, it gets added to this need to do list. And I can add a few others, so buy carrots, walk dog, wash car, and now if I want to get rid of one, maybe buy carrots, maybe I completed that task, I can just click the delete button for that one, and it's gone. Now clearly this app is very simple, right? There's not a whole lot going on here. However, it gives us enough to sink our teeth into for us to really learn a lot about front-end JavaScript and working with the web browser. So without further ado, let's jump right into the action. Go ahead and create a brand new code pen. And instead of JavaScript, let's actually begin with a bit of HTML. Let's begin by creating a heading level 1 that reads to-do app. And just a quick note that I want to keep the focus in this course on JavaScript instead of HTML. Now, even if you've never worked with HTML before, the syntax is fairly simple, so you might be able to just follow along with me and have it somewhat make sense. But if it's super confusing, you might just want to pause this lesson and go search Google or YouTube for a quick HTML beginner guide. You don't need to do that preemptively. I would only do that if the HTML is making zero sense to you and you're super confused. Okay, let's keep the train rolling. So after the heading level 1, let's create a form element. So opening tag, closing tag. Inside this form, let's give it two things. A text input field for the user to type into, and then a button that they can click on to submit the form. So to create the field, we can just say input. Let's give it a type of text. I'm also going to set its autocomplete to off, just because I don't like the annoying little pop-up on the field that tries to suggest things that you've typed in the past. Okay, next, let's include the button that the user clicks. So button, and let's have the button read, create item. Okay, and then finally below the form, down here, let's create a heading level 3 that reads need to do. And while we're at it, let's also add a bulleted list with a few hard-coded example items. So UL for unordered list, and a quick CodePen HTML tip. You can actually just type the name of the tag you want without any of the less than or greater than symbols, and then push tab on your keyboard, and it automatically does that for you. Okay, inside the unordered list, let's create a couple of list items. Ultimately, we want the user to create these. We don't want to preemptively hard code them, but let's just do this to give ourselves something to work with. So I will say buy carrots, and then we want to include a button here that says delete. And I'm just going to copy and paste this a few times just so we have something to look at. So maybe buy apples, buy lettuce. Okay, now all together, this HTML should look something like this in the web browser, right? So this is our basic user interface for the app. Now, when a user visits the app, we don't want there to actually already be items like this. We would expect this to be empty, and then the user would use the input form to add the items. So, big picture, it's the job of HTML to display content on the web page, but HTML on its own just sort of sits there and doesn't move or do anything. So it's the job of JavaScript to make this come to life. So where should we begin with our JavaScript? Well, I think we should focus on our form input. Now before we jump right into the JavaScript column and start coding, let's first adjust our HTML to give the form element a unique identifier. In other words, we need some sort of way to hook on to this form in JavaScript. So in our HTML, on this opening form tag, we can just give it an ID. So maybe say ID equals, the name doesn't really matter, but I'm just going to choose our form. The idea here is that now we can search for the element that has this ID over in our JavaScript. So now let's switch gears and go into the JavaScript column. Now in the past, we've learned about the document object, which represents the web page's content and abilities. And in the past, when we wanted to be on the lookout for an event, we would use add event listener, right? This is how we would listen for click events. However, in this case, we don't want to use add event listener for the web page as a whole. So we don't want to use it directly on the document object. Instead, we want to select just that one particular form element. So check this out. Over on our JavaScript, we can say document.get element by ID. For the argument, we just give it the ID. So we called it our form. And this method is going to return an object that represents that HTML form element. Now, since that's what this method is going to return, we could just add a dot here and say add event listener all on one line like that. But instead, what I like to do is save the object that this is going to return into a variable. So at the beginning of this line, we could say let our form equal the object that this is going to return. This way our code just stays a little bit easier to read. So then on a brand new line, we can say our form, and then we want to add an event listener. So add event listener. And just as a quick test, because we are familiar with it, let's pass it click. And then remember the second argument is the function that you want to run when this event happens. So let's just include an anonymous function here. Or even one step better, why don't we use an arrow function? So parentheses, and then the arrow symbol, and then curly brackets, and we can drop down inside the curly brackets. And just as a test, when someone clicks anywhere on the form, let's show an annoying alert pop-up message that says, "Thanks for clicking the form." Okay, now let's test out our code. If we come down to the preview area, notice that if I click somewhere random on the web page, like the heading level 1 title, nothing happens. But if I click onto the form, we see the alert. Awesome. I think you can already see that adding an event listener to a particular element instead of the document as a whole, this already opens up so many doors. Now, we don't actually want anything to happen when the user simply clicks onto the form. So instead, the event that we want to be on the lookout for is actually called submit. So up in our JavaScript code, instead of click here, let's get rid of that and say submit. So anytime the user submits this form, we want to do something in response. However, the default behavior of a web browser when you submit a form is that it's going to try to send that data off somewhere. In this case, we want to handle things completely from within our JavaScript. So we don't want the web browser to try and send the data anywhere. So what we can do, within the parentheses for our function here, let's include a parameter. I'm going to call it E, but you could name it whatever you want. Okay, and then inside the body of our function, we want to look inside that parameter. Now I named it E because the add event listener method is going to pass our function a bunch of information about the event that just happened. So the E is short for event, but basically down here in our code, we want to say e.prevent default, in parentheses to call the method. I realize this is a bit confusing and not very intuitive. It's just one of the intricacies of the web browser that we have to deal with, right? Its default behavior is to try and refresh or reload the web page and send that data off somewhere. We don't want that to happen, so we are just preventing it. Okay, now let's check out our app again. So now I'm free to click onto the form and nothing happens. But as soon as I try to submit it, awesome, we see our alert. Okay, now next, we don't actually want to show this annoying pop-up. So when the user submits the form, what we really want to do is grab the value of whatever they typed into this field and then add it as a new item into the list. So we are going to need to be able to access this input field from within our JavaScript. So let's go into our HTML and give it a unique ID, so we have something to hook onto. So back up in our HTML column, here is the input that lives in our form, and maybe right after the word input, let's give it an ID, and you could come up with any name you want, but I'm going to call it our field. Okay, our field. So then over in our JavaScript, just like we did with the form, remember we created a variable that stored the object that represents that HTML element. Let's do the same thing for our field. So up here I'm going to say let our field equal document get element by ID, and it had an ID of our field. Okay, now in our function that runs when the form gets submitted, instead of this annoying alert pop-up, let's get rid of that. And just as a test, let's log out to the console whatever the user has typed into that input field. Right? We want to practice accessing the user's input. So we know that that field is represented by this our field object. So we can just say our field. And in the web browser, the object that represents that form field has a property, so we can look inside the object, for the property named value. Let's test this out. So back on our web page, be sure to open up your console. If I type into this field, hello there, and submit, awesome. In the console, we see hello there. Now we don't actually want to just log it to the console. What we really want to do is add a new item to the bulleted list. So why don't we go into our HTML and give this unordered list an ID so that we can hook onto it from within our JavaScript. So in the HTML, down towards the bottom, remember the bulleted list is contained in this unordered list element. So on the opening UL tag, just say ID equals, the name I'm going to choose is our list. Okay, so we can hook onto this in our JavaScript. So back in our JS code, up at the top, let's create an object that represents that unordered list element. So let our list equal document get element by ID, our list. Okay, now we could write the necessary code right within this arrow function, but I want to stay organized. So down at the very bottom of our code, let's create a brand new function and name it create item. The name doesn't matter, that's just what I'm going with. So parentheses, curly brackets. Okay, now up in our arrow function, instead of logging to the console that value that the user typed in, instead, why don't we just pass it to our new function? So instead of console.log, let's just say create item. Okay, now if we are passing this as an argument into the function, we want to be able to receive it as a parameter. So in our create item function, let's just include an X or something easy to type for the parameter. Okay, now here's the fun part. In the body of this function, let's select our list object. Remember, this object represents that bulleted list. And then let's look inside it and call a method named insert adjacent HTML. So we give this method two arguments. The first argument is where in the element do we want to add the new bit of content? Well, I would expect that a new item gets added to the very end of the list. So in our code, for the first argument, I'm going to say before end. And then the second argument is just the content or HTML that you want to add to this element. So we could just say a string of text that says hello or some sort of test, but instead we know that we can just include our parameter here, right? Because this parameter represents whatever the user typed into the field, right? Because that's what we're passing into our function. So for the second argument, I'm just going to say X. Now let's test this out. So if we come down to our app, I will type in wash my car and then submit the form. Awesome. It gets added to the end of our list. Now it doesn't look quite right, and that's because we need to wrap it in an li tag, just like we did with the other elements. So let's actually go back into our HTML. And we don't need these anymore, right? We want the list to be empty when the user comes to the app. But why don't we copy and paste one of them as an example to save ourselves a bit of typing in the JavaScript? So I'm just going to copy the first one, copy that into my clipboard, and then we can get rid of all of these hard-coded items, but keep the empty, hollowed out, unordered list. Okay, and then back in our JavaScript, down in our create item function, instead of just X, so instead of just literally adding the word that the user typed, we want to add a bit of HTML. So here's what I'm going to do. Inside this function, right above this line, let's create a variable and call it our HTML. The name doesn't matter, that's just what I'm picking. And then let's create a template literal. So 2 backticks. Inside the template literal, let's just paste in our clipboard. Right? So this is the template for an item. And then let's hollow out by carrots. We don't want it to be hard-coded to that. We want to do something dynamic. So in a template literal, you can say $ curly brackets. And that is where we would pull in the X parameter, whatever the user typed in. Okay, so now we have this HTML template for the new item. We saved it into this variable. So down here, instead of adding X into that unordered list, let's just add our HTML variable, right? This nice little template. So let's test this out. Down in our app, let's say feed cat. Submit the form. Awesome, there it is. Create another one. Buy carrots. Perfect. Let's do 2 more things. First, let's set it up so that when you submit this form, it erases the current item that you've typed. Right, because if we successfully added buy carrots to the list, we don't need that in the field anymore. We want to be able to just type a new item in instead of having to select it and delete it. And then after we set that up, let's also make it so that when you click the delete button for one of these, something actually happens. Okay, but let's start with auto clearing the field when you submit it. So up in our code, inside our create item function, why don't we just add a new line and say our field, right, the object that represents that element. Let's look inside it to access its value, and then let's just set its value to equal an empty string. Okay, also, if the user clicks the submit button instead of hitting enter or return on their keyboard, I think it would be cool if when they submit, if the text field got automatically selected or focused again, so that if they wanted to add another item, they wouldn't need to manually click the field again. It would just already be selected and ready for them to type. So in our code, we can also say our field dot and then call a method named focus. Okay, let's test this out and see how it works. So buy carrots. It got rid of it for me and I can just keep typing. Feed cat. And even if I use the submit button, so walk dog, and I click this, it automatically selects it. Awesome. Now let's finish up our app by working on the delete functionality. So we want to respond to the event of the delete button getting clicked. Now our first instinct might be to try and use the add event listener method, right? So maybe try to select all of the delete buttons and then call add event listener, but we would run into an issue. And that is that when the app first loads or when the web page first loads, there aren't going to be any items, right? This area is going to be empty. So there would be no delete buttons. And in JavaScript, you cannot add an event listener to something that doesn't exist yet. Now there are several ways around this problem, this issue of adding events for future elements that don't exist yet, but right now I'm going to show you probably the simplest way of handling it. Why don't we do this? Down at the very bottom of our code, let's create a brand new function. So function, let's name it delete item. The name doesn't matter, that's just what I'm going with. Parentheses, curly brackets, and inside the body of this function, just as a test, let's create an alert pop-up that says delete requested. Okay, now the question is, how can we run or call or execute this function when the user clicks on one of the delete buttons? Well, in our create item function, Remember this line of code where we are creating the HTML template for an item? Well, here's the HTML for the delete button. So check this out. On the opening button tag, we can just say on click equals, and then we can just give it a little bit of code to execute. So we can just say delete item, parentheses, to call that function. So let's test this out. Down in our code, if I add an item, buy carrots. And if I click the delete button, awesome, we see that delete requested pop-up. Okay, now we don't actually want to show a pop-up. What we really want to do is delete this list item from the list. However, imagine we have maybe several items in the list. When we click a button, we need to know which item just got clicked on, right? We need to know which list item to delete. So check this out. Within our HTML template, inside the parentheses for delete item, when we are calling it, we can just say this. Because the web browser considers each HTML element an object, well, when this function runs, what is the object that is calling it? You guessed it, it's the element. So if JavaScript considers that the object that is executing this function, that's what it's going to set the this keyword to. Awesome. So that means the element that needs to get deleted from the page is going to get passed into our function. So in these parentheses, we can create a parameter. I'm going to call it, the name doesn't matter, but I will name it element to delete. Okay, and then instead of that annoying pop-up, let's just access that element. So element to delete. Now this is going to point towards the delete button that got clicked. But we don't just want to get rid of the delete button. We want to get rid of the entire bulleted list item. So we can just say dot parent element. And that's going to select the HTML element that is housing this element. Okay, so once we've selected that, then we can just call dot remove to remove the element. All together, let's test it out. So buy carrots, walk dog, feed cat. And if I want to get rid of walk dog, let's click delete. Awesome. Now that's going to bring the hands-on portion of the lesson to a close, but let's talk about where we go from here. Because there's one huge glaring problem with our app. And that is that every time the web page gets reloaded or refreshed, all of the user's items and data is going to get reset. Right? If I come up to our code and even just add a couple of forward slashes to force CodePen to reload the page, all of our data is gone. Obviously, this is a big problem. So in the real world, we would need to store this data somewhere. Now, we could save it to the user's physical device using a web browser feature named local storage, but that's not ideal because if the user switched from their phone to their laptop to their desktop to their work computer, their data is not going to follow them around. So, in the real world, the only practical solution for some sort of persistent data is to send it to a server or some computer that's, quote, in the cloud in order to save it to a database. Now, databases do not understand web page elements, meaning we can't exactly just send a bulleted list of HTML content over to a database. Instead, we want to send raw plain data, like strings of text, or objects, or arrays. So that's why we spent so much time in this chapter learning about the JavaScript language itself and working with raw data. Because as we saw in this lesson, working with the web browser is relatively easy. The challenge comes when we realize that we need to manage two completely different things. So one is the raw data, for example, right, an array of the user's items like this, buy carrots, walk dog, feed cat, right? Servers and databases want raw data like this. But raw data like this doesn't mean anything to the users that are actually using our app, right? So the other thing that we need to manage is the visual user interface. Now, managing those two different things at the same time can be very overwhelming. And this is why libraries like React and Vue.js and Angular are so incredibly popular. Now, ultimately, in the real world, I do recommend using one of those libraries. However, until you can clearly understand and describe the problem that these libraries are solving, I recommend staying away from them, because I've seen countless beginning developers suffer from the disease that is called trying to learn everything at once and getting confused and giving up. This is a disease that plagues millions of people around the planet. Now, I'm not proposing anything extreme. I'm not saying that you need to be skilled enough to create your own library before you use someone else's. I totally disagree with that line of thinking. All I'm saying is give yourself a chance to understand the bigger picture, how all of the puzzle pieces fit together, and at least understand the problem that a library is solving before using said library. Because I guarantee if you genuinely understand the need for a library and how it fits into what you're trying to achieve, it makes learning the library 500% easier. It makes it a piece of cake. Okay, but learning a particular library is not the goal of this course. Our goal is to understand the full scope, the full stack of an application. In this lesson, we saw the general idea of how JavaScript can control the web browser. So, up next, in our next chapter, we're going to dive deeper into why we need a server, or at least a third-party service, where we can send our data to. Now, a lot of people get intimidated when they hear the word server or cloud. But I can tell you right now that with the right guidance, there's nothing to be scared of. We're going to walk through the server side of things together, and it's actually surprisingly simple. So let's keep things going, because this is where our progress is just going to start skyrocketing. We understand the basics of the JavaScript language itself, and now it's time to just see how all of the different environments work together, right? We just took a look at the web browser. Up next, we're going to learn about Node, and then eventually we can learn about MongoDB and how to save our data in a database. If you can seamlessly tie these three environments together, you are a full stack developer and you are incredibly in demand. So let's keep our momentum rolling, and I will see you in the next chapter. Congratulations on finishing the 10 days of JavaScript. In the full course, we build an application together, complete with user registration, user sign in and sign out, user-generated content, asynchronous or live on-the-fly actions in the browser that are talking to a server and database, and a whole lot more. The full premium course has not officially launched yet, but if you subscribe to this channel, you'll be notified as soon as it's out. Or if you're watching in the future, it's already available. Thank you so much for coming along on this 10 or 11 day journey with me. I hope you feel like you learned something, and stay tuned for more web development tutorials. Take care.